meaningful as possible. The ironies abound, of course, as we know about American history in 1776, and what led finally to the decision to go to war, right? Had a lot to do with taxing, didn't it? And unfair taxing policies. In some ways, you can read Smith as saying that he kind of saw some of this coming down the pike. Chapter 3 talks about public debt, and this is the final chapter, and it's a disturbing one to read even in today's political climate. He says it's natural for some people to want to hoard wealth. States, he says, will often go into debt because they need to wage a war. States will often go into debt to keep the justice system working as well. States sometimes, he says, have to borrow money to keep going, but it's a very dangerous process. He says, one day, public debt, in the end, and this is his prophecy, will ruin all the great countries of Europe. Wow, think about that prediction. And finally, he says, Britain maybe needs to re-examine itself, and maybe it's not as great and as wealthy as it appears to be, or it thinks that it is. It needs to be maybe a little bit more judicious in its view of itself and his relationship with the world. Of course, we ask this question, was Smith predicting in some way the coming collapse of the English colonies and the war that would soon, in the end, lead to victory for the colonists and independence, and of course England having to live with the ramifications? It is an amazing thing to think that this is where he ends, from taxes to finally the issue of debt. Well, let's work really quickly at level 2 and 3. At 2A, well, if it is true that in some sense your money or your nation is its money, its wealth, we would say, not its money per se, right? That's an interesting idea. Of course, another one here is that economic policy has to be intentional. It can't be random, and it has to be articulated clearly to all members of society, or certain members of that society will begin to feel disenfranchised, and then they will not want to be as much a part. I mean, one of the arguments that he makes about education is that all children need to be educated about the notion of economic class structure. And therefore, there are people who are in fact more wealthy than some people, and that's the way that it should be. In other words, education is a way to make sure that everyone understands the rules of the game. It's an interesting idea. The poorest, one more message here, have to be considered, Smith argues, right? And again, education is the key. Sounding very much like what we said about Frederick Douglass and his notion that when you are a slave because your mind is not allowed to be free. Right? Economically, we would say something very similar for Adam Smith. At level 2B, notice the real-life examples, very international. We've mentioned several. He talks about everything from China to Portugal and everything in between. It's quite remarkable. And of course, he loves his word pictures. Like we said, that notion of the invisible hand that it somehow, interestingly, controls markets, but nobody ever actually completely understands how it happens, as long as everybody's thriving. At level 3, well, there's a lot of different texts. He mentions one of the real dangers is this quest of mining for gold. And he even mentions El Dorado. We think about Voltaire's classic Candide, when Candide shows up at El Dorado and there's just gold all over the place and he's putting it in his pockets. And they're like, what are you doing? Those are just rocks. No question, we will read Marx, his Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, only really to understand it well if we've read this text. As well, we've mentioned it, Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published in 1776, as well as the Declaration of Independence in 1776. I think for us to really appreciate the influence of those texts, we have to know Smith's Wealth of Nations. Finally, at 3B, we can ask some personal questions. To what degree are you your money or your wealth? Right? To what degree are you your parents' money? If you had been born into a different family with less resources or more resources, would you be a different you right now? Are you in fact your nation's wealth to the degree that you've been educated or uneducated by virtue of where you live? How important do you think wealth will be in your future? An interesting question for you at 3B. Do you think that when you are 30 years old, you will be less financially as well off as your parents were at 30? Do you think you'll be equal, or do you think you'll be more than your parents were at 30? What are your thoughts about debt? A final question. What are your thoughts about debt? do you think that we are a nation with tremendous debt at the moment? Do you think that's a bad thing instead of a scary thing? And to what degree, maybe, have you not given full consideration to the importance of that? I hope that our study of Wealth of Nations will challenge you to give some consideration to some of these topics. Our next volume, now volume 11, we will turn to Darwin's Origin of Species. Both of these texts, Wealth of Nations and Origin of Species, are what we call transformative texts. They will move culture to begin to think and consider ideas in radically different ways, and the implications are, of course, phenomenal. I hope that you will enjoy your study of Wealth of Nations. I've enjoyed sharing the ideas with you. Thank you.